Air Conditioner Compressor Replacement, a step-by-step guide. Our 2005 Saturn Vue has the 3.5 liter V6 from Honda. This makes for some interesting repairs at times. The air conditioner compressor is one of those that require removing a lot of the parts from the engine just to get the compressor out and a new one back in. It's located at the front of the motor, next to the front catalytic converter, between the engine block and the radiator fans, below the alternator. Oh, and by the way, there's a cross member right below it as well. Based on YouTube videos we looked at, there are two ways of removing and replacing the air conditioner compressor. Through the bottom by dropping the front subframe, or the other way is by removing the motor mount on the passenger side and jacking the motor up. Based on my experience of working on this car, the motor mount removal was the way to go for us. The compressor had died and stopped cooling a week before the idler bearing died. When that happened, I carefully drove home with it sounding like this, and after letting it cool down, I started to work on it. At the end of this video, I'll show what failed inside the old compressor. First was to get it up in the air enough to easily get under it. For this, I used my leveling ramps that I featured in the video RV Life Hacks Volume 3. The link is above and in the description. Next is removing the air filter housing and duct. Anytime something is done on this side of the motor, this whole unit has to come out. But really, there are only 2 bolts, 2 clamps, and 1 sensor to be concerned with to take it out. After removing the air filter housing, you can now see the serpentine belt, the tensioner, the alternator, and the compressor. To remove the belt, I used a 14mm box wrench on the bolt of the tensioner, pulled it toward the back of the car, and removed the belt. Just as a side note, it's best to slide a bolt into the lock for the tensioner at this point to keep it out of the way. Then we disconnected the battery. At this point, I called our friend John. He's a certified air conditioning mechanic, and I asked him about how to safely get the R134a refrigerant out of the system, and how to flush the system when the time came for that. He told me he would bring his new recovery system over and give me a hand with the project, just so he could try out his new system. With his system, we pulled out less than a pound of refrigerant. That really showed that there was no refrigerant or oil left in the system. But at least we did it the correct way. With the refrigerant safely removed, we could start removing the parts that we were replacing. The compressor, the filter dryer accumulator, and the orifice tube. All of this was part of a kit that I bought from Napa Auto Parts. The order of removal of these parts is not important. Each has its own challenges, and so I'll start with the compressor. To remove the compressor, we started by disconnecting the pipes that connect it to the rest of the system. This is a simple 1 bolt and remove the pipe. The electrical connection is next, and there are just 2 plugs on the compressor, one on the pipes that were just disconnected, and the other by the pulley. Next, we put a jack under the motor, put a block of wood on top of the jack, and lifted it enough to take the load from the motor mount. We then removed the bolts from the motor mount and pulled it out. Then we just jacked it up to make room. The alternator was next. Just 3 bolts, 1 on the bottom, 2 on the top, then with a little prying, came right out. And then we just set it aside while it was still connected to the wire harness. We also removed the timing belt cover at this time above the alternator to gain a little bit more room. With the alternator out of the way, the 2 bolts on the top of the air conditioning compressor and the 1 on the bottom were relatively simple to access. But the real reason to remove the alternator and the motor mount is that with them in place, the compressor will not come out this way. One more thing had to be removed before the compressor had enough room: the mounting plate for the alternator and the compressor. The mounting plate is held on by 4 bolts, and it also has the tensioner mounted to it, but that can stay in place on the plate. We pushed the compressor out of the way, then removed the 4 bolts and pulled the plate down out of the way below the compressor. With the plate below the compressor now can be lifted right out of the space. Then we pulled the mounting plate out so we could clean it up. The filter dryer accumulator is located behind the driver's side headlight. We started this by removing the marker light on the side of the headlight, then removing the headlight bolts on the top, using a 1/4-inch drive extension that was long enough to reach under the headlight and push the latch that holds the back of the headlight. So we then pushed that latch, lifted the headlight at the same time, and it comes loose. Now that we had access to the filter dryer accumulator, it's held in place by a bracket. The bracket has a small screw on the side that holds the bracket together. Unscrew this, and then the bracket just splits in two. Then disconnect the hoses and the filter dryer comes out. The orifice tube is mounted on the firewall next to the brake booster. One bolt in the middle will release the hoses that connect to it. Then after that, there are 2 Torx screws holding it to the firewall. Now that the parts are removed, the cleaning process can begin, starting with covering all of the open hose connections to protect us and the car from the PAG oil and the solvents of the flush. Then using the pressurized flushing tool with the flush inside, we put a little of the solvent in each of the hoses and the evaporator and condenser. After a little bit, we then blew it all out with high pressure air. We used cardboard in some places to catch the solvent that got by the rags. We also cleaned the mounting plate and got ready to put it all back. For the compressor, the mounting plate had to go back in first, be placed on the bottom of the space, then the compressor could be slid down into the space and set aside. We then mounted the plate, then the compressor was mounted to the plate. Then the alternator was put back in place on the plate. Installing the rest of the parts was the reverse of the removal. After that, just put the car back together. Next was the purging of the air from the system. John's vacuum pump did this very quickly, and then we added the PAG oil and refrigerant. The air conditioner works so well now, and even when the temperature is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it makes it comfortable. Now, about the old compressor, it was leaking oil for a long time, and then it kind of stopped. Well, this is what happens inside a compressor when it has no oil. This project took us parts of 2 days to complete. That's because of parts delays. That and the next project delayed me in putting the videos together for a week. Our next video will be on replacing the timing belt and water pump on the Saturn. After that, I hope to be back on our normal video release schedule.
Thanks for watching our video. If you like what you see, press the like button below and subscribe. And also check out our other videos.